Okay, so when I was a student, um, when I was a student in a master's program, in in undergrad, they really hadn't covered Adler very much. I mean, I had heard of Adler. There might have been like a chapter on Adler, but nobody was really interested in Adler in undergrad. And that might have been different for you. Maybe you learned a lot about Adler. I don't know. But I was fortunate in my master's program, which is, Shippensburg, just like yours at Penn West. Um, One of my professors, Becky LaFountain, just happened to be the president of the Adlerian Society in North America. And she was really interested in Adler. And I learned a lot more about Adler than I had anticipated. And even though I was never interested in Adler previously, I really learned to like his theory. And one of the things I liked about Adler is that he was really positive. He believed that people were discouraged, and uh, it helps to encourage or empower people. Um, so he's from the same school in Vienna as Freud was. He was a good friend of Freud's. So let's talk a little bit about Adler's background. 1870 to 1937, from Vienna, grew up six boys, two girls in his family. So one of the interesting things is, remember, Freud had a lot of death anxiety. So, death anxiety is fear of one's own death or dying. Grief and loss is someone else's death or dying. And he also, his nanny left, uh, was fired at a very early age, and he had that loss. But you're going to notice that a lot of theorists experienced a loss at an early age or an illness of their own at an early age. And, I think that loss or illnesses where we fear our own death, our own mortality, uh, people who don't have a loss or don't have a personal illness or anything like that tend not to think about death and life and mortality until a later age. Um, but if you have that experience at a young age, it kind of changes your mindset about what you think about and maybe even about life itself, or perhaps the meaning of life. And so you'll notice that a lot of the theorists that we cover either had an early loss in their lives or they had an early illness of their own in their lives, or both. So Adler's brother, Rudolph, died at a very young age, and it was of some illness. Uh, Adler himself was very ill throughout his youth, constantly aware of his own mortality because he lost his brother and he had his own illnesses. He almost died at the age of 4 because of pneumonia. So these two events were really early impacts on Adler's life. Um, he was not a great student early on in school. He found it very hard to succeed in school. Um, and yet he he had some internal motivation to overcome those barriers and obstacles. Uh, and he worked harder and he was able to succeed. And he eventually went to medical school at University of Vienna, which is where Freud was at. Um, and so he became a doctor, and He practiced ophthalmology, which is, the healing of the eyes, and general medicine, and later neurology, the brain, and then psychiatry. And so he had a really well-rounded medical education. Um, when he got to, uh, psychiatry, um, he really looked at what Freud had done in depth. Um, as a doctor, one of his primary interests, because of the loss of his brother and his own illnesses, was incurable childhood diseases. Um, so, he wanted to investigate and come up with solutions uh, so that other children didn't have to suffer in the same way he did. Um, so, he worked with Freud for almost 10 years, which is a long time. They were great friends. And he was the president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Um, but, you know, Adler had his own ideas as well. And he didn't want to look at sexuality with everything. He thought there was a lot more to psychiatry and psychology than what Freud uh, talked about in his own theory. But he wanted to add his ideas to Freud's theory, but they would just constantly argue about it because it was like Freud's way or the highway. So eventually they ended their friendship, separated. He resigned his position as president of Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and he formed his own. Started his own theory for individual psychology, individual therapy. And, I think he came up with a pretty nice theory and a lot of ideas of his own. Now, here's the interesting thing about Adler, and it's really the thing that I like beyond being a very positive person. Um, I think if you really look at all of the intricacies of Adler's theory, that you'll find that some of the most popular theories today stole their ideas from Adler's theory directly, like CBT, REBT, and a lot of other theories as well. Uh, so, um, yeah, I think that one of the problems with his theory is that it wasn't organized in a way that people could apply it easily to clients. Like it didn't have a step-by-step kind of instruction manual. He just had a lot of different ideas in his theory, and they weren't organized in a very good way. So another thing that happened to Adler, he served in World War One as a doctor. So let's talk about World War One a little bit. So World War One was really the first war where they had what we would consider modern weaponry. So, you know, the other thing is, uh, if you ever watched a movie like All Quiet on the Western Front or Tolkien or something like that, you'll know that um, there was a line uh, between France and Germany called the Western Front that um, was really uh, a line uh, where the two sides fought their battles, and it was all trench warfare. And so they had modern machine guns and they had um, shells that they would fire and they would explode and all kinds of different ammunitions. Um, and they also had mustard gas. Now, when we think about it, you know, if you think about being in a trench, trench was fairly safe. If you got up out of the trench, there was a machine gun firing at you, and there was kind of no man's land until you got to the other side's trenches. And people would kind of have to run across there. So people really didn't want to charge unless they were ordered to. And however, mustard gas is heavier than air. So if they shot canisters of mustard gas and they landed in the trench, all of the mustard gas would settle in the lowest part of the ground, which would be the trenches. They had gas masks, but a gas mask wasn't good forever. You could only stay in the gas so long, and then you had to leave the trench. So that created a lot of stress and trauma, and people were living and fighting in very close quarters for extended periods of time. They saw a lot of horrors. Another thing was that World War I or World War II, they did not have the diagnosis of PTSD. And I think that a lot of people had PTSD, but it wasn't recognized at the time. Now, when they would shoot, uh, artillery and the shells would land and explode, yeah, they would hurt people physically, but if you were within the blast radius, uh, it would change the air pressure and hit you pretty hard with a wall of air. And it would knock you back. Um, so the impact of that explosion could hit somebody hard enough that your brain would bounce off the back of your skull and hit the front of your skull, and that was called a contre-coup. Um, but the problem is that is very hard to diagnose without modern imaging like MRIs and CAT scans and things like that. So Adler saw all of this happening. And as a World War I doctor, he would want to treat the soldiers. And he believed in looking at the patient as a whole person. So back then, they would call, post-traumatic stress disorder shell shock. And that's why they called it that. But they didn't really know whether it was a result of emotional trauma or whether it was physical brain damage, or maybe it was a combination of both. So, you know, Adler really wanted to look at all of the possibilities, not just the physical possibilities. After the war, he opened up 32 child guidance clinics in the Vienna public schools and trained teachers, social workers, physicians, and other professionals. So this was some of the very first resources in public schools ever. And, you know, the reason he placed these resources in public schools, first of all, a lot of parents had been killed in the war, but it's the one place where a community could locate a number of different resources to provide for children in need. And, whether it was a doctor or for education or, social workers if the family needed help in other ways. So it was the one place where they could get multiple resources if the resources were there. Um, Around 1920, he lectured in the United States, eventually died of heart failure. There's still Alfred Adler schools and institutes throughout the world. You can be trained in his theory. Um, and he believed that the benefits of education on an individual and a society um, could could change society. He believed that re-educating people could reshape society. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Let's compare Adler with Freud at a very minimal degree. So Adler stressed social relationships, not sexual urges. Adler stressed the conscious, and Freud stressed the unconscious. Adler stressed personal choice and responsibility, not blaming one's past or parents. And even though Adler was a doctor, he didn't adhere to the medical model to the same degree that Freud did. So there's a lot of differences between Freud and Adler. I can't believe personally that Adler's theory is so different, so much more positive, more modern in my perspective than Freud's was, since Adler spent 10 years studying with Freud. So, you know, during that 10 years, he must have been accumulating quite a few ideas um, as he and Freud talked and worked on, uh, psychoanalysis. Um, so he believed that an individual's perception of the past could influence his or her present actions. So that's really the beginning of kind of the root idea in a lot of different theories. Um, so other theories would rephrase it a little bit and they would say our interpretation. It's not the event that creates our feeling, it's our interpretation of the event. And we can choose how we interpret an event. That is within our power. So, you know, two people may have had the same exact experience in the past. Perhaps they were both riding along in a car, they were in an accident together, and they both walked away from it. And one of them might have said, "Oh, I can't believe this horrible thing happened. It's ruined my day. I'm going home." And the other one who's in the same exact accident might say, "Oh, what a miracle. What a wonderful day. Let's go celebrate that we weren't harmed at all." So, two different reactions to the same event. And it results, so that interpretation of the event, that perception of the past, changes the feeling as a result. So many people think that feelings come first, but they really don't. It's our perception or our interpretation of an event or even a thought, and that results in feelings. Um, so Adler coined the term inferiority complex. And I think he really believed that he felt inferior as a child because he didn't do well in school. He struggled a lot. And it affected not only how he did in school, but his whole perception of how other people saw him and how he saw himself. And, you know, he thinks that feelings of inferiority, they have both positive and negative effects on people or people's reactions. So um, the more positive effects would have to do with people wanting to overcome the obstacles that are causing the inferiority complex. So if they succeed, they'll feel better about themselves if they overcome the barriers and obstacles. So that might give them motivation to try harder. Whereas the negative part of an inferiority complex is that people might end up giving up too soon. If they're feeling a lot of negativity and experiencing a lot of failure, they may end up giving up. So it could affect people in two different ways. For Adler, it affected him in a very positive way. And, you know, it gave him motivation to succeed. Later on, when we look at social learning theory, Bandura would say a lot of times our self-efficacy will decide whether we have internal motivation and keep trying until we succeed, or whether we give up too soon, even though we might have the ability to do it. We don't believe we do, and we give up too soon. But we'll cover that later. But I think this relates a lot to that concept of self-efficacy with Bandura. So, Freud focused a lot on younger ages. Um, I think that one of the things that people misunderstand with Adler is that Adler says around the age of 6, we begin to plan a life goal. Well, people take that a little too literally, and a lot of Adler's um, thoughts, uh, he wrote in German, so everything is translated. And so sometimes we're not getting the full meaning of what he's saying. So at 6, we're not going to decide what we're going to do for the rest of our lives. Okay. But if we pretend to be some occupation, it will give us some enthusiasm and internal motivation to learn more about that. And that might change. And then we'll be interested in something else. I remember my daughter, very small for her age, around the age of 6, and she watched that movie Zootopia about a little rabbit who wanted to become a police officer. Everybody said, "Oh, you're too small. You can't be a police officer." And but of course, she ended up being a great police officer. And she really tuned into that because she was small and she wanted to do some big things. And so, you know, for the whole entire year of around age 6, she wanted to be a police officer like the rabbit in Zootopia. So, we had to get her all the outfits and the badge and everything else. And she wanted a birthday, a Zootopia birthday. And we were in at like Chick-fil-A, and there was a whole table of police officers eating at Chick-fil-A. And she runs over to the table and she says, "I want to be a police officer." And she invited everybody to her birthday. And I'm thinking, oh my God, now I'm really going to have to clean the house. And and fortunately, they declined. But, and they had a bunch of stickers that they give the kids because they know there's going to be kids in Chick-fil-A. And she just had a great time with them. They did a good job with her. And, but, a year later, she became interested in working at a zoo you know? But what this does is creating these pretend life goals is that it gives kids motivation. They explore, what does this person do? What would it be like working with animals? What would it be like being a police officer? Whatever they're interested in, it gives them motivation to grow and explore possibilities. And that's all Adler's really saying. It sounds permanent. They create a life goal at age 6. But it's not really that at all. You know, it's almost like, why do kids play pretend? You know, it's because they're exploring and learning and growing and imagining what it's like to be an adult. And that gives them motivation. So that's really kind of a misunderstood concept of his. Um, Rather than like Freud believed a lot of things happen to us and we're the result of things that happen to us. Adler believed that we take an active role in our human growth and development. And, so yes, our lives are influenced by events, things that happen. We all, bad things happen to people, good things happen to people. Uh, we're born into different types of families. But he also believed, so yes, we're influenced by what happens to us, but our future is not determined by heredity and environment. So the important thing is that, um, he believed we have a choice and we can change and we can grow. We can overcome negative things that happen to us. So it's not really what we have or don't have, it's what we do with what we have. So it goes right back to that overcoming obstacles, making the best of things. It's that positive and encouraging outlook on life that he had. Um, but we do have to take in, not everything is possible. We have to understand that every person has their own limits. So, like a personal example is I used to be a really good runner when I was young. And by young, I mean like, 12. Like at 14, I did a marathon um, and, had a pretty good time. And, um, you know, however, even though at that young age, I was able to run a marathon, under 4 hours, I realized by the time I was 16 that I could never, compete nationally or internationally. It the sport couldn't be my career. So we have to realize our personal limitations, and then we begin to reframe the roles that these interests and activities take. So, you know, um, I began to pursue other interests, uh, but I kept running as something I loved to do. And that's all it was. It was something I really enjoyed doing. And, so we kind of have to place things in perspective. Yeah, we can overcome things that happen to us. Our future's not determined. Um, and yet every human being has some limits, you know. I know that when I was a school counselor, so many kids, uh, you know, wanted to, you know, be in the NFL or the NBA or be rock stars or rappers or whatever it might be, fame. And, you know, and everybody had said, yeah, you can be whatever you want to be. So I don't want to be the crusher of dreams as a school counselor. So what I always did was, and some of them were great athletes, some of them were great singers and performers or actors, anything's possible. But so I always encouraged them. But I also said, we have to have a backup plan. So let's say you do get to be, you know, a NFL football player. Um, you still need to know how to manage that fortune and fame, you know? So you probably want to play college ball. Well, what would you take in college? And we start processing, all of these things, like, What would your major be in college? Football is not a major. So we kind of came up with a lot of other possibilities that they would still find fulfilling, you know? Uh, and, you know, so I think we need to encourage, but also provide some realistic alternatives as well. So be positive, but also provide some realistic alternatives. Um, so I think that Adler did incorporate some existentialism and phenomenology, in that he really wanted to understand a client's subjective reality, their view of the world. He wanted to put himself in their shoes so that he could better understand what they were feeling and experiencing. And that's what I like about phenomenology. Um, and, I think he was better able to counsel clients. So phenomenology leads to empathy. Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes leads to a better understanding of how they're feeling, and that's empathy. Um, I want to give you some of the kind of vocabulary that he uses. Um, So fictional finalism, and this is called, um, a few different things depending on the terms that he uses, but it's one's imagined central goal that guides people's behavior. So he believed that goals often guide people's behaviors. And that's where Glasser got the idea for, goal-directed behavior in reality therapy. So regarding the personality, it wasn't id, ego, superego, but he thought behavior was goal-oriented and people strive for success. Now, this is often interpreted from German as superiority, but it's not really superiority over like I'm better than you are. It's being the best that we can be. It's being the best person that you can be. You don't have to be in competition with anybody else. So it's personal success. Um, so it's really kind of a translation thing with that. In order to overcome feelings of inferiority and find significance and meaning and acceptance. Um, One must consider an individual's lifestyle. So let's talk about lifestyle, okay? So even though Freud would talk with a client, he would call him a patient, and tried to get information in order to make a diagnosis in the medical model. Adler was also a medical doctor, but he wanted to understand what he called the individual's lifestyle. And he used the word lifestyle as we, as therapists, use the word assessment. Okay. So his lifestyle uh, inventory is basically our intake assessment. Now, it was much more primitive, but it was really the first one. And, he would interview people and try to get all kinds of different information. And one of the things that Adler really focused on in his lifestyle assessment, but not the only thing, was sibling position. So, birth order. And that's what our discussion post is going to be on for this week. And so, but lifestyle included more than birth order. What was growing up for you like? Did you have any hardships? Did you have enough to eat? Did you have to work as a child? Did you have any illnesses? Do you still struggle with anything? And he went through from kind of as far back as they could remember up until present time that he was talking with them. And he tried to include as much as he could in his lifestyle assessment. But it's really the very beginning of what we see as a modern intake assessment. Um, in DSM, you're going to learn a much more comprehensive intake assessment that includes all of the different domains and everything from medication to, previous diagnoses and things like that. All right. So this is my favorite word, Gemeinschaftsgefühl. And, translated, Gemeinschaft is community and Gefühl is feeling. So community feeling. And what that means is that, um, we need to have a social interest in our lives. We can't be too self-focused. Um, the more one develops a social interest and becomes a member of the community, the healthier one becomes and the less of our sense of inferiority. It also creates a support network for us. We're no longer alone. We have help. We have people that care about us, and we care about them. Humans have a genuine need to connect with others. So I'll share a personal story of why this is my favorite word. And so there was a time in my life when, I had been in a lot of jobs and a lot of schools, and I finally got my doctorate. And, but in my mind, I'm like, oh, when I get my doctorate, I'll feel complete. But I didn't have any feeling after getting my doctorate. It was really just another piece of paper. And, so it really didn't change the way I felt about myself. At the same time, I, uh, I had lost a grandmother who, you know, lived with us while I was a child, so somewhat of a caretaker. And a significant relationship ended, and I needed a job, so I moved down to Charleston, South Carolina to teach at the Citadel. So it was getting any new job is very stressful, and um, being away from all of my friends and family and moving to a different state was very stressful and also a bit isolating because I really didn't know anybody down there. And with this mixture of all of these changes and losses in my life, I started to get depressed. Um, I wouldn't say that it was, severe, like I didn't have major depression, but I was pretty depressed. Um, and so, being a therapist, I started to analyze myself, and I went through so many different theories, CBT and, all kinds, grief and loss, and all kinds of different theories. The more I thought about myself and dwelled on my depression, the worse it got. So I felt like I was almost wallowing in my depression. And so I'm like, wow, I've tried all of these different theories. None of them are working for me. I was teaching a theories class just like tonight, and I was teaching Adler. And I came across Gemeinschaftsgefühl. And I'm like, I'm going to try that. And so, you know, I started thinking, well, what would give me a good community feeling? Maybe volunteering at a food bank. And so I did that, and a local church had a food bank, and I volunteered, and I felt good about, helping people who are hungry. And I met other volunteers, and I started doing it on a regular basis. And then, they invited me to go to the church, but it could be any organization. And so over the next month, I became a member of a local community and I made new friends and I helped other people. And you know what I wasn't doing? I wasn't focused on myself. And so sometimes refocusing our minds to others helps quite a bit, especially if we're focusing on helping others, creating a new network of friends and community. And, you know, it definitely helped me through that period in my life. And before I knew it, I was feeling pretty positive again. So now, when I have people in therapy, you know, yes, we have to understand what's happening. We have to, do an intake assessment and process what's happened to them, any traumas. But we also have to kind of get them out of their own minds and focused on other and community and supports. Are their supports healthy or not? Maybe they need healthy supports. Maybe they need a new community that's truly supportive. Maybe helping others is just as much good for them as seeking help themselves. So I always include this concept as part of my therapy. Um, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about birth order. So he includes birth order as part of the larger lifestyle assessment. Now, he would call family and relatives and the makeup of that family the family constellation, like a star constellation. The stars come together to form a picture. And when he better understands the family constellation, he gets a better picture of the individual and the family system. So Adler's really, because of the family constellation and that concept, it's not just birth order, it's the concept of the family makeup, how they interact. This is why Adler's considered to be one of the very first family systems therapists, even though he wouldn't call himself that. He was one of the first people to really look at the interactions of a family. He also took into consideration early recollections, um, birth order, earlier lifestyles, perhaps they've changed, what's the current lifestyle, things like that. And so, as you look at your birth order for your discussion post, um, what tends to happen is that people identify with the good aspects of their birth order, but perhaps not the critical aspects. But if you have a sibling, they seem to match all of the critical aspects of their birth order position. So see if that rings true or not for you. Now, this is just also a generalization. You're not supposed to meet every single thing that Adler says for that birth order position, but you might find some familiarity with a couple of them. So, as you look at your birth order, see what matches, see what doesn't. Um, you know. All right. So, at the end of the notes for Adler, there is um, a handout, Adlerian overview of birth order characteristics. And it's 2 pages. and it goes through all kinds of birth order things. Now, the one thing I realized, my sister's like 10 years older than me, and my brother's 2 years younger than me. If you have a sibling that is 9 years or more older or younger than you, it's up to you whether you include them in the birth order. So, in some ways, my sister took the role of a caregiver. In another way, she was in my life as a sister, but she was still in the home living with us until I got older. So I include her in my family constellation. But sometimes siblings are older, they go away to college and start their own life while you're still very young. It's up to you. If you think they had an impact on your life, include them in the birth order. If you think they were somewhat distant because of age, you don't have to include them in your birth order. So that's the deal with the birth order. Um, Adler asked some pretty good questions. Why don't people change and lead a healthy lifestyle? And, he would say that this was due to private logic. And I think a lot of this logic is unhealthy. And CBT and REBT took a lot of these early concepts and included them in their theories. So, private logic that Adler's referring to, private logic that hinders our move to a healthy lifestyle, prevents us from living a healthy lifestyle, is usually due to some type of negative private logic, like people are convinced that nobody cares about them. People reject others before being rejected out of fear of rejection. People are too self-critical. They have that negative self-talk going on. That CBT would call it cognitive dissonance. REBT would call it irrational thoughts. Um, they may have a negative or discouraged outlook. They may struggle with poor self-esteem. So all of these are examples of private logic that prevent us from being healthy. And this logic is often irrational. So as a result of some of this logic or irrational thoughts, uh, people might not be social. They might not have the relationships and the support that they need. It may lead to discouragement. So in Adlerian therapy, part of therapy tries to discover, the purpose behind their behavior or symptoms, and then help the individuals to, you know, understand that this is faulty logic and change these thought processes into more positive and realistic thought processes. He believes that people can always correct faulty assumptions. People can always change for the better. Um, yeah. So that's the end of the basic notes, but I also included a few other things that are important. So remember I said that this was a very disorganized theory. And so a guy named Dreikers really liked Adlerian therapy too. And he realized that there wasn't really an orderly fashion to this theory. And so he created one. He created steps to therapy. And so you can read Dreiker's ABT model, so Adlerian brief therapy. And you know, and I gave you the entire outline for ABT, Adlerian brief therapy, that was created by Dreikers, who was an Adlerian follower. And I think it includes most of the things that we've talked about. Um, and you know, so I think it's a nice orderly way to address his therapy. I also included like links to his institutes, but don't stop there. And this is the big problem. Don't stop there. That's not the end of the notes. Don't say, "Oh, I read all the notes. I'm done." So I so one of Corey's original books, like edition two, I think we're on like 10 or 11 now. But like in edition two, he included a chapter on Adler that had 2 or 3 pages of Adlerian techniques. And I copied those and put them in your notes. And it's sideways, but you can print it and read it better. But read these techniques. Like some of them are directly taken into CBT. Um, I like spitting in the client's soup, um, catching oneself. That's definitely a CBT, REBT thing. Um, so you can just read through these techniques. We're not going to have Adler on an exam, but it's good to know some of these techniques. And and then after the techniques comes the 2 pages of birth order characteristics. So, questions about Adler or comments or any stories or whatever you'd like to ask or contribute to this theory. You like Adler better than Freud? Heck yeah. He's a lot more positive. He makes more sense. Not everything's sexual, not creepy. There you go. Yeah.
The whole time we were talking, like the whole Adler discussion, when I was reading from our notes, the whole thing I could think was it was a lot like my undergrad, which was all CBT based. And I was like, oh, this feels familiar. It's just like different wording.
Yeah. Only CBT stole everything from Adler.
Yeah, what I've learned.
Yeah. It's interesting how that happens. What else? Anything else? Did anybody have like a nice undergrad intro to Adler, or did they cover it for you? Okay. Anything different? Okay. All right. Um, and